What's up, guys, and welcome back to Gabe Miller Music. Today I want to talk about and show you some advanced ways to get more out of your hardware synthesizers, whether you're working with budget stuff or something a little more pricey. This won't focus a ton on specific aspects of actual sound design. I've done some other videos on that I'll link at the end of this one, but these will be some specific techniques that you might not have considered that can help you get a more polished sound out of what you already have. First of all, this might be fairly obvious to some of you, but it's worth mentioning anyway. Use creative post-processing on your synth tracks. When working with hardware, it's really easy to get into the mindset that everything's got to be all hardware all the time. But I would say don't dismiss a hardware-software hybrid approach. If you're going out of your way to have a completely 100% DAW-less setup, I definitely understand that and have at it. But if you're going to be layering a bunch of sounds coming out of just one or two synths, then chances are you're going to be recording that into a DAW anyway, so you may as well embrace the power and flexibility that gives you. And there are a few things that I specifically want to draw your attention to and a few specific plugins that I find myself using a lot. First of all, there's the topic of adding a vintage flair to sounds. Maybe you're dealing with like a virtual analog engine in your synth, or you just want to bring a sound more to life, or you want to make a budget modern synth sound much more expensive and retro. Use plugins that are emulators of old effects. For instance, Arturia made a plugin that emulates the classic Juno chorus, and that can bring that classic sound out of a lot of different synths. And of course, there are emulations of other classic effects like reverbs and delays and compressors, and ways to make stuff sound more like it came, say, out of a tape machine. There's Sketch Cassette, which I haven't personally used, but I've seen it used. I tend to use Super VHS by Baby Audio quite a lot, and these can absolutely bring sounds to life and make them sound a bit more organic. There's also stuff that just adds vibe. Another Baby Audio plugin that I've been absolutely loving lately is Spaced Out, which adds a really nice reverb and delay, and you've got a bunch of control over how that stuff functions, including reversing the delay, changing its density, getting some kind of high and shimmery sounds out of it. It sounds really cool. By the way, I do want to mention this is not an ad for Baby Audio. I do have some contacts within the company, but they've never asked me to make videos about their stuff. I just happen to really like it. I would also recommend messing around with plugins to push a synth beyond its physical capabilities. For instance, a pretty intense distortion can take a sound in a completely new direction. If you do want to keep everything hardware and have stuff be even more unique, using guitar pedals can often be a great way to interject some interest into sounds, especially if you're trying to keep everything all hardware all the time. Let's move on from the general topic of effects and get into some more specific techniques. One bummer about working with hardware synths, especially ones that are a little more in the budget range, is that they often have mono outputs. And at this point, we're pretty used to the sound of wide stereo synths in songs. So there are a few ways to work around this. Of course, you could add effects like chorus or stereo wideners in post, or you could do what I've been messing around with lately and getting really nice results out of: record your synth part twice with two similar but subtly different patches. Here's an example of that, and then I'll break it down real quick. First of all, it's worth mentioning that in this case, the microfreak is being sequenced by the circuit, and so both times that the synth part was played, it will be exactly the same timing-wise. What changes is the patch itself. This also means that the movement in the filter cutoff is exactly the same for both the left and the right. What changes is the unison. In this case, I'm using a supersaw engine, and I have the unison of that supersaw slowly modulated by a sine wave LFO, and it's out of sync with the beat. What this means is that I can just record the exact same synth part twice in a row, split that, stack them on top of each other, and then pan one left and one right. Because the unison is slowly being modulated, it'll be subtly different every single time that chord progression is played, and panning them left and right creates that difference needed to get stereo width. And you could, of course, take this technique a whole lot farther, but this is a pretty solid example. And this also brings up another really important aspect of sound design that I want to touch on, and this is movement. Go out of your way to create subtle change over time in your synth patches. Whether a filter cutoff moves around a bit or slowly lifts over time, or a parameter of your oscillator slowly changes, or you introduce some kind of warble, like a filter wobbling around a bit, or one of my favorites, a very subtle pitch warble. This can often give a slightly vintage edge to a sound, and is pretty easy to program in a lot of synths. If you want to take this even further, do something similar to what I did in the first example with the two supersaw patches. Create some kind of movement that's just detached from the grid and not synced to the tempo of your song. This can create a bit more interest in evolution and variation, and you can take it pretty far. The more you go out of your way to create movement and even create a bit of chaos in your sounds, the more interesting they'll be, and often the more professional they'll sound. At this point, when I'm doing sound design, this is always a box I try to check. How can I add movement to the sound, and how can I inject a little bit of chaos or unpredictability? And finally, let's talk about one very specific technique, which is to cheat limited polyphony. This can come in a few forms. First of all, if you have a mono synth but want to record chords with it, just take the time to slog through recording a bunch of individual notes, and with a bit of planning in advance and enough patience, you can turn a monosynth into a polysynth, sort of. But there's another way you can kind of cheat limited polyphony that I want to talk about. If you've got a polysynth that just has a limited number of voices and you want notes to ring out and not cut off previous notes, try recording your part in phrases. This is obviously just scratching the surface of ways to make stuff sound better, so if you've got any go-to techniques that you found helpful, be sure to leave them in the comments below, and you can check out more videos about sound design up over here somewhere. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll be back with a new video in a little bit.